I get scared sometimes.
But as I always say,
It's okay to be afraid.
as long as you face the fear.
And keep moving forward.
Count on Regents, the name trusted in insurance since 1941. Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oregon. Live fearless.
Good morning, and welcome to Eye of the Storm, Fundamentals of Protecting Your Organization. Today's speakers are Anders Erickson and Matthew Solomon. My name is Greg Jackson, and I will be your session moderator. If you have questions for the presenters, please ask those using the Q&A box, which you will find by clicking the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you would like to chat, simply want to say hello with other attendees or let the group know which district you're from, please use the chat feature, which you can be found near the Q&A option. I will collect questions as they are submitted and ask them of our speakers at the end of the presentation. You can click the like button next to the attendees' questions to upvote them, which will indicate that you would also like that question answered. At the end of the session, please visit the session page within the platform to complete the session evaluation. Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anders and Matthew.
Hey everybody, we appreciate the opportunity to be here today to share this cybersecurity presentation. We're going to be presenting some principles that can help you help you protect your organizations. Just like sports cybersecurity has a lot that can be seen and viewed as sort of advanced and complicated. But when it comes down to it, success really is just a matter of fundamental activities that an organization provides. It's just like dribbling, passing, and basketball. There's certain principles in cybersecurity that are fundamental, and we want to help your organizations understand what those principles are and begin to implement those so you can save yourself the heartache of a security breach and feel confident in your ability to be secure in our current IT environment. My name is Anders Erickson. I'm the principal in charge of cybersecurity services at Eide Bailey. Eide Bailey is a top 20 accounting firm in the United States. We have a large technology consulting practice, of which I'm a partner in. Our footprint is mostly west of the Mississippi, but we do work in all states, about 3,000 staff and partners. Joining me today is Matt Solomon. Matt, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Matt Solomon from Eide Bailey. I'm a manager within the risk advisory there. I usually work with clients trying to be proactive. We also have incident response, things like that, but I usually work with clients trying to prevent cyber incidents.
Good. So we got some learning objectives today, some things we want to share with you. Make sure you walk away with some important tools. The first is just to begin a better understanding of cybersecurity risks that are out there. Make sure we understand that we're all kind of in this together and nobody's flying under the radar when it comes to cybersecurity risks and issues. We want to teach and share some practical insights to help protect our cybersecurity and reduce our cybersecurity risk. So just sort of some practical everyday insights. And lastly, we want you to understand the cybersecurity services that are available to you through SDAO and through Eide Bailey. So we'll talk a little bit about what we're here to do, what our role is, and how we can help you. For our agenda today, we've got a couple things just to outline kind of what we're going to be talking about. The first is that we're going to talk about some common cybersecurity risks, things that the market is seeing where organizations are struggling. We'll talk about some common misconceptions because there's a lot of misconception about cybersecurity out there. What am I a risk at? What am I not a risk at? And we'll talk about some security breaches, what we've seen. We've got an incident response team that usually goes in after an incident has occurred. And Matt and I are part of those teams. And so we can bring to you and share with you some of the insights we've seen both as a firm and across the industry when it comes to some of these cybersecurity breaches. We'll introduce and provide an overview of the cybersecurity guidebook that we've developed for SDAO and its members. We'll talk with you about how to use that guidebook, how to apply it to your own organization. And lastly, we'll talk about some fundamental cybersecurity controls. Again, the idea being that there's some fundamentals, some foundational controls that'll help you as an organization be more secure. We'll talk a little bit about those. We recognize that those on the call today aren't all IT experts. We recognize there's lots of different sizes of organizations. And so as we're talking today, we're going to try and keep it at a level that's going to be helpful for organizations and for the participants. If you do have questions, please don't hesitate to include them in the question and answer. If we can, we'll try and address it right away. If not, we've got some time set aside at the end that we can address your questions. So let's just jump into it. Let's talk about some of the common cybersecurity risks. These, again, are what organizations are facing nowadays. The first is business email compromise. This is really where a criminal is trying to get information from an organization. So they send out an email that appears to come from a legitimate source, seems like it's legitimate, but in fact, it's not. It's from the vendor, or from the hacker, and they're trying to get information from you. So example of this would be like a vendor that the organization works with, a company that you work with frequently. They send you an invoice, but the mail address or the account number is updated, and really it's been updated by the criminal. They send you a false invoice, but they know that you do work with this company, and so they send this to you, and you pay that invoice, and it goes to the new address, the new account, and so now they've gotten those funds instead of the legitimate company. Another example of business email compromise would be a CEO that emails her assistant and asks that assistant to purchase a dozen gift cards to send out to employees for rewards. And she says, well, just send me the serial numbers so I can email them right away to the employees. Well, it's really the cyber criminal posing as the CEO, and they're going to use those serial numbers to cash those in themselves. And so this idea is that we're going to impersonate something. We're going to have you perform an activity that you wouldn't intended to do. An example of this is we had a company in the Midwest. This is not a company, actually, it was a nonprofit organization. It was a convent, and the CEO was out of town, and the CEO was out of pocket, but the office manager received an email from the CEO saying, would you wire transfer $200,000 to this account? And so the office manager just thought, yep, this is how I usually get it from the CEO. So they took that email, they made the wire transfer of $200,000. And it wasn't until a week later when they're in an office meeting and this office manager asked the CEO about this particular incident, and the CEO's like, I didn't send that email. That wasn't from me. And so that's when they called us in. Our incident response team came in, and digging a little bit deeper, we realized there was something more going on here. What we found as we did our investigation is that the CEO's email account had been compromised by criminals, and that they had been able to see what was going. They knew the CEO was out of town. They had been watching the traffic. They saw the types of email requests for wire transfers that the CEO had sent to the office manager. And so they basically had known the exact time to send that, the right format to send that in, and it made it look like it was coming right from the CEO. What we've also found, though, is that CEO, their email account had more access than they really should have had. And they actually had global email access. So the hackers potentially could have seen any email was ever sent by anybody or received by anybody in the organization. And when we went back and did our further investigation, we found 10 years earlier, somebody had sent an email with an Excel spreadsheet attached that had 1,300 employees and their social security numbers. And so it really blew up, and there was a huge disclosure they had to take and provide credit monitoring for all those current and past employees. And so it became a really, really big cost, not only the cost in the wire transfer fund, but also the hundreds of thousands of dollars in remediation to be able to go out and do the investigation remediation. So you're looking at, $400,000 to $500,000 in the cost total for this one business email compromise. So you can see these things escalate. This wasn't a large organization. This is a convent. It's a nonprofit, but they had some pretty significant costs that came out from that business email compromise. Social engineering is an area we see a lot of organizations challenge. Social engineering is really just it's just psychological manipulation of people, trying to get them to perform an action or divulge information that they wouldn't otherwise. Business email compromise is really a form of social engineering, but there's other types too. There's a broad range of social engineering, things like not only phishing, if you've heard of phishing emails, but also what's called smishing and vishing, scareware, spear phishing. There's a lot of different types of social engineering, but the whole idea is that the criminals are trying to get the recipients to do something they wouldn't normally do. Ransomware continues to be on the rise. Ransomware is a type of software that when it gets on a computer, it begins to encrypt everything that they can touch. Anything that user on that computer has access to, it will try and encrypt. And it'll encrypt it so well, the only way you can unencrypt it is if you have the digital key. Well, the criminals have the digital key, and they're going to say, we're not going to give you this key unless you pay us, hence the name ransomware. So you get a ransom, the software, you have to pay a ransom if you want to get your data back. And we've seen different types of ransomware, different uses of ransomware, even more so now where criminals will actually steal information, drop the ransomware, and then say, hey, I've got your information, and I will actually, you have to pay me a ransom, or I'm going to divulge this information, make it all public. And so if you have some confidential information that they've stolen, you're going to be motivated to pay the ransom. So we had an organization that called on us. This is an egg producer kind of in the Midwest, and they had initially got ransomware, used their backups to kind of clean things off, felt like they were in a good place. But then a week later, one of their customers was actually Walmart security. The team called them and said, hey, you've got a bunch of information out there on the dark web. And this company went out there and found all that that hackers had actually, the people who had dropped the ransomware before they had left, actually stolen a bunch of information. So they hired us to come in, and we helped pull down that stuff from the dark web. We helped them see what was in that information. They ended up not having to pay the ransomware because they didn't have a lot of confidential information. But what they did have in there was a little embarrassing because they'd offered different customers different pricing. And so when that got all out there, it became a real embarrassment, and it took a little bit of time to kind of clear up. So it was just not only the cost of just being down and trying to get back up, but that embarrassment was not something I wanted to deal with. And lastly, malware is just any software that's designed to damage computers or servers or networks. So ransomware is a type of malware, but malware is much broader. Things like spyware, Trojans, key loggers, worms are all used by criminals for different purposes to try and take advantage of a network, to try and disrupt it, try to damage it, try to help manipulate it. Well, one more just quick example there. There's a manufacturer in the Midwest that we did work with that brought us in because they had malware that got on their network and quickly infected everything. The whole network was infected, and their backup, and we came in and we helped them. By the time we got there, everything had been infected and their backups were not working. And so we came and helped them rebuild their network, but they were down for a week. And in that time during our investigation, we identified that, hey, you not only did you have this malware, but it looks like the criminals actually stole some of your intellectual property. And so when we talked to the CEO afterwards, he said he'd lost $1 million to $1.5 million just being down for that 1 week in cost and time. But I can imagine that even that pales in comparison to the potential loss from the information that was actually taken, the proprietary information in some of their manufacturing processes. So as you can see, this is really disruptive stuff. There's a lot of risks out there. It's hitting organizations of all types. Nobody's immune to it. And the impacts of these security risks are pretty big. Exposed employee data, lost inaccessible customer or company data, systems being down, strain on internal resources, potential loss of revenue, unplanned costs due to compromise. And what's sad and interesting is that when we look at the breaches that we've seen, one breach doesn't hit just one impact. A breach will hit multiple impacts. And so you look at this list of 5 impacts here, and a single breach could hit 3 or 4 of these. They are incredibly disruptive. And so the key is to be prepared ahead of time, to put into place the security and the controls that'll reduce your risk as best as you can based on your organization. Reduce that risk so you don't have to deal with some of these challenges that we've talked about this morning.
Yeah, and with a lot of these, all these incidents we see and stuff, there's a lot of misconception out there, especially with cyber in general. The first one, only large organizations are targeted. Everyone hears about Facebook, they hear about the Target and Home Depot because these are huge, massive Fortune 500 companies, so it sort of gets that misconception of, hey, they only target these super rich or super large organizations, which we find is very untrue. I mean, a lot of our clients, Anders was talking about a few examples, most of those were, under 50 employees sometimes. I mean, they're not large organizations and they're not, publicly traded companies. These are just small sort of mom and pop shop kind of thing where it's just like it's a farm, it's a just a little manufacturer that does something small. It's very, very small, so it's not always those massive large organizations. The second one there is cybersecurity's role is solely an IT issue. I mean, obviously, a lot of people think, hey, when it comes to cybersecurity, that's an IT issue. They're the ones with firewalls and they're blocking things and all that kind of stuff. But really, it is an organizational thing, around awareness, how you should handle data. If you do receive something or if you get a phone call asking for information, those are the kind of things you really, this is an organizational thing. It's not just an IT. IT does play a huge role, and they're obviously trying to put things in place to prevent them. But overall, it is an organizational, and even down to the employee, just having awareness and not just clicking on everything that comes in. And sort of along the line with that is the sort of the third one we put down there is, outsourcing to a vendor washes our hands of any liability. A lot of times, we see organizations, hey, we just outsource all of our HR stuff to some hosted solution. They handle everything. And what's bad about that is, yes, it takes away some things, you are putting some things in place. Obviously, this organization probably has very good, standards in place, but at the end of the day, you are trusting this organization. You sort of have to do due diligence. You have to ask them certain questions. How are they handling your data? Are they sharing it with people? Do they have third parties themselves doing things? Those are the kind of questions you sort of want to ask. And especially even if it's just not an application like your HR, maybe it's your whole IT, like, hey, we just outsource all of our IT to a service provider, they handle everything. There's still a lot of things, just like onboarding and things that they won't ever know. They're not there in the building. They probably don't know when an employee leaves. So you have to be aware of that and make sure you notify them so accounts can get disabled. So again, it's not just we can outsource all of this. One thing we always hear when we go in there with incident response is something along the lines of this: it will never happen to me. Everyone we've talked to, I mean, in some form, they've always said this. I just can't imagine it happened to us. Why did this happen? And again, this sort of comes back to, it's not just large organizations. It can really happen to anyone. We've been talking to CEOs of just small little 25 employee shops where they're completely down. They don't know what to do. And they're like, I just would have never thought this happened to me. And we just see it constantly. So whenever we do these kind of presentations, I do always like to talk about some incidents and breaches of the past year. And Anders was talking a few of our examples. I just like to put this up, and these are obviously large organizations. You've heard of a lot of these, Facebook, Walgreens, Microsoft. They all within the last year have had major incidents. I know someone had asked a question about, do they ever catch the criminals for these kind of things? Unfortunately, especially with a lot of these, they are never caught. That's why I think it is such a issue, is because it's very difficult. A lot of times, people are overseas, so obviously you run into a lot of international things, and it's very hard. When money gets transferred to bank accounts, if you don't get to it fast, and it's weeks later, that money usually is very hard to retrieve. So they're very, very rarely get caught. I'm not going to go into detail about any of these ones, but I did want to talk about a few recent breaches that were just much smaller, or at least organizations that are probably more relatable to the audience today. And so I just want to talk about a couple of these. And just over a year ago, we had Jasper County, South Carolina, suffered a malware attack in their 911 response center. And really what that is, it didn't take them down, and they were still able to answer the phone calls stuff, but they did find out, hey, we were really reliant on computers, because that's where everything was entered. That's how they dispatched, and they had to go back to the old manual. I have to write this on paper. I have to make phone calls to get to alert people and get things out. Those are kind of things that hey, maybe data wasn't lost, but there was a disruption, and something like that, especially in 911 response center. I mean, that can be devastating. And Jasper County is a very small county. I mean, we're talking like, I think it was 25,000 people in the whole county. So I mean, it's not like it's a metropolitan huge area. I mean, this is just, again, a very small thing. Then in January 2020, also in South Carolina, in Greenville, their water authority suffered a network outage due to a cyber attack, and it knocked down not just their network, all their phones, the website. So yes, the water kept flowing, which is great, but the problem is people, if you had, hey, I have a leak and I want to call in and say, hey, need water turned off or pay my bill, all that stuff was taken down. So I mean, it was a huge disruption for the area. And again, it's not so much, hey, we lost data, it's things aren't even just functioning correctly. The third one down there is a public library out in California that actually got hit with ransomware, and not just once, but it actually got hit twice. And I know a lot of people thinking, well, it's a library, but again, everything's on computers now. Where books are, all your accounts, there was also infected all the computers in there, and a lot of people go to the public libraries to access, the internet because maybe they don't have it at home. All of that stuff was taken down in January. They restored a lot of things. They got backups up, but the problem was is they didn't really fix anything. They just sort of got everything back up and running and still had those huge flaws. And it happened to them a little over a month later. It happened to them again, and they had to go through the whole thing. So I know we said this, and I think we bring it up again, but just because when you have an incident, you can't just rely on backups and go, hey, okay, we'll restore them, we're good to go. You sort of want to have those investigations, be like, how did this happen? Because you need to fix those issues so it doesn't happen again, or we just keep seeing the repeats. There was one in the paper just yesterday, I think it was, in the UK, a company paid millions of dollars in ransomware twice, because all they did was they paid it. They thought, okay, we're good to go. We got everything back up. And 2 weeks later, they got hit with a thing again because they didn't fix anything. And the last one we have down there was just a few months ago. It was just a small regional health district up in Spokane. And, again, this was just a small organization, less than 200 employees at this health district. And it was just a quick little email that went to the wrong people that had a bunch of patient information. And again, it just shows that you don't have to be a large organization to have issues. And we like to sort of share some statistics with you guys. And 54% of companies have experienced one or more cyber attacks in the last 12 months. We're bringing up these kind of things. And what we see is more and more of it, and I brought it up, a couple times now, is once you do get hit, you're almost labeled and people know, hey, we should go after them. So they keep going after you. And that people who don't make changes end up having multiple incidents and, back-to-back kind of thing, which can be devastating.
Matt, maybe just one comment here, because I mentioned that earlier, that manufacturing company that had that malware, and and they lost like $1 million because they were down for a week. And what was sad is 8 months earlier, they had a wire transfer fraud incident, and they asked us to come in and do a risk evaluation. So we came into the risk evaluation, we gave them a list of recommendations, said, here's where you got to start. You got to put these things in place. 8 months earlier, we told them, here's the things you need to do. And they made the business decision not to implement the changes we had made, and then they get the ransomware. So we could have saved them all that time, all that money. You got to take seriously when you get hit with ransomware. When you're seeing indications that, hey, we might be at risk, you got to take these things seriously and begin addressing the problems.
So here's just a statistic, and I've seen a lot of these statistics that come out, and this one is actually one that actually shocked me. It was things, but a cybersecurity venture predicts global cybercrime costs will grow by 15% per year over the next 5 years, reaching $10.5 trillion annually by 2025. And that's up from $3 trillion in 2015. And obviously trillions of dollars is a hard number to wrap your mind around, but it's sort of comparing that, we said, they looked at, that total is exponentially larger than all the damage from all natural disasters in a year. So in 2020, globally, there was only $210 billion in natural disasters from hurricanes, fires. And to me, when you talk in your trillions, it's exponentially. And to even put that into bigger perspective, is that, last year was $6 trillion in cybercrime costs. If that was an economy, that would be the third largest economy in the world, only behind China and US, which is just mind-boggling.
So this continues to be increased costs, and it's hard to believe anybody's going to not be impacted and affected by it, because it's so universal and impactful.
So with all of these kind of things and these statistics things, we always get, a couple of questions. People always ask, where do we start? And if we're going to do one thing, what should we do? And that's sort of where we're going to start talking about today, about that cybersecurity playbook and things.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what Eide Bailly is here to do. We've been contracted by SDAO to provide a handful of services during 2021. And so I want to kind of introduce some of those today and talk about one of them specifically. So the first thing we've been contracted to do is to develop a cybersecurity guidebook for SDAO members. And so this guidebook is intended to help member organizations begin to implement or see what next steps they can take to secure themselves and protect themselves. So we'll talk a little more about what that is and how to use it. The second thing is we're going to conduct a series of 5 webinars on various cybersecurity topics. This is the first of those webinars, but we'll have 4 more throughout the year. You'll get some notifications of those, and each member can send representatives to these webinars to gain knowledge and gain understanding, to have conversations about cybersecurity. We'll cover topics like incident response planning, vendor management, things that are going to be relative to many of the organizations that are members of SDAO with SDAO. So you'll see more information coming out about those webinars. We'll also conduct 3 security awareness training sessions. These will differ from the webinars, and the webinars are going to be specific topics related to cybersecurity, where the security awareness training is a general security awareness, security hygiene that is applicable to any employee at any member. And it's going to be available to all employees. And so many of your organizations might already have a security awareness program, already have training, but if you don't, or if you look at the content for these and say, hey, my employees, we could really use that, you'll have that open invitation. These 3 security training sessions will all be the same content, but just spaced throughout the year, so you can go to one or participate in one. Your employees can participate in one that makes the most sense from a time perspective. But we'll talk about things like how to operate online, how to be secure when you're doing email, how to set up a home network that's going to be secure. So things that are relevant to everyday employees. And lastly, we're going to provide office hours for members to talk with cybersecurity experts. And so as your management team is working through the guidebook and thinking about how we are going, what's our next step should be with security, as your IT team or IT service provider is working to implement some of the next controls or next security controls, or is trying to determine which products or security solutions will be most helpful for you, you can set up some time to meet with some of our cybersecurity experts to get some feedback, to get some guidance as you're developing cybersecurity policies. We can help guide you on some good resources and some good content for those security policies. So this is just office hours that we're going to make available to SDAO members as requested and by reservation. So let's talk a little bit about the cybersecurity guidebook. Again, the guidebook is intended to provide SDAO members with tactical steps that'll help them protect their organizations from cyber threats. So we want these things to be very meaningful and hands-on. The guidebook is based on industry best practices, and the most common root causes our incident response teams observe during their post-investigation. So when we go in and there's been an incident, one of the questions we ask both the incident response team and ask ourselves if we're talking with the client is, what could they have done that would have saved them all this heartache? What are the things they could have put in place? And so utilizing that, we wanted to utilize that information and say, well, let's make sure organizations from a preventative standpoint put those things in place that would save them, would have saved this company, this organization that got breached. Now I'm going to throw up another slide here that's going to really look at sort of our approach to not only this guidebook to best practices. There's a lot of information here, so don't feel like you have to digest it all. We want to begin getting in front of you this approach to best practices. And what you'll find is some of your organizations already have some of these things in place. But what it does is help you see sort of a roadmap of where you want to be and begin to identify areas where you can improve. What we're going to show you here is in the guidebook, so you'll have this, and the slides will be made available after this as well. So don't feel like you have to understand everything at once. So what we're presenting here is this best practices approach to cybersecurity, and the idea is that fundamental to any organization's security are these core principles. And on the left side is this foundational principles. There's 8 things in here that any organization should be doing. I don't care if you're Walmart or if you are a mom and pop shop, these things are applicable to you and they're going to help you be secure. And before you go worrying about all the other security implications of things you could do, get these foundational security things in place. And we'll talk a little bit about those today. This is going to be the focus of where we are for most of the rest of this conversation, is to really talk about this sort of stage 1. All organizations really can and should implement or consider the stage 1 foundational security principles. And then as you get those in place, look to stage 2, 3, and 4. And what you might find is if you're a small organization, maybe stage 1 is all we're going to be able to do. That's all we need or can do. Maybe we'll do stage 1 and a couple things from stage 2. But as you're the more mature, large organization should really be starting at stage 1, but looking across stage 1 to stage 5 to understand where are their risks. And maybe we do want to have something at all these different stages and progress and our maturity across all these stages. So the idea is that organizations start with stage 1, move up to stage 5, identifying those controls that are applicable to them. But let's talk today about stage 1. And before we get into the details of this, I'm going to have Matt talk a little bit about the guidebook itself, because if you've had a chance to look at it, or when you do look at it, you'll see it's set up a certain way. It's intended to be pretty straightforward, and we want to make sure that you know what you're looking at when you get in there.
Thanks, Anders. And one other thing when we did create this, I'll go through this in a second, is we did try to make this, again, very tactical and very digestible. So obviously it's not one of these things where, hey, we got to take a week off and sit down and just knock all these things out. It is each of these little controls you can, hey, review and spend a few hours here and there and try to get in a better security posture. So that was our thought process. But so when you're talking about the guidebook and just the layout, we broke it in each of our controls into 4 different sections. We provide an overview, which, again, this is just a high-level explanation of the security control. And this, you might already know what some of those you saw in there. We said something like multi-factor authentication. A lot of people already know what that is, but for people who don't, we just want to give a little explanation about that kind of stuff. Then the second piece is, why are they important? We really want to give an explanation to organizations of why this is important, because people, you can hear all these things, hey, this is best practice, you should be doing this, but really, we like to provide some backing of, hey, this is why you should really be doing it, so you make it a little more impactful. And especially if you have to convince leadership or other employees, be like, hey, we really need to do this, so we provide some of that information. And then the configuration section, this is where we really actually get into those tactical things So for each of those controls, we actually have different tiers, and we'll get that into just a second here, but we'll sort of explain, hey, these are the things you should be doing. And we can, it'll make a little more sense when we show you that, but it breaks it down to something that's, bite-sized chunks. And then the last section for each of those controls is some questions. So if you're like, hey, we don't have control over our computers and things, we outsource all of that, that's no problem. What we did is we actually came up with a few questions for each of these controls that you might just want to ask your service provider, because some of these service providers, maybe security isn't their main focus, and you just sort of want to ask them, and you'd be like, hey, how do you handle this or do this? So we provided some of those questions you can ask them, and then give you a little bit of, hey, if they say this, maybe that's a warning sign of a potential issue.
Yeah, maybe just one point of clarification. When we talk about sort of this layout with the overview, sort of the impact or why it's important, the configuration or the steps you can take to actually put in place in the managed service provider question, we've got this outline has been created for each of, go back one slide, for each principle or each security control, as Matt called them, in these. So so each of these has all 4 of those sections to help you walk through the importance of each of these and what you can do to implement it, or what the questions you can ask your service provider for each of these, all stage 1 through all the way through stage 5. Now, so now what we're going to do now is walk you through one particularly. We're not going to go through the details of each one, but we want to walk you through privileged access.
Yeah, and we're just gonna, sort of jump right into this, and we just want to show you, like, hey, this is how it's actually laid out. This is actually screenshots right from the guidebook, and we'll just walk you through this first one of privilege access. So as you see there, this is stage 1, step 1, privilege access, and we just provide a little bit of an overview. So if you don't know, privilege accounts are, those are the accounts that have higher access to organizations' information systems than a general user. They're usually, you can find them for specific applications or on a specific device or the entire network. So there's some examples down to the bottom of, things you may have heard, like, hey, domain admin. This is something, hey, that gives you access usually to everything. I can get onto any computer, every server. Those are usually, you've maybe heard as like keys to the kingdom. Those are the kind of things that's usually a privileged account. But you also have, if you just have an application, sometimes you just have administrator accounts. And what that usually does is a general user, if you're talking about like a financial system, a general user, maybe they can just enter, records or new entries, things like that. But an administrator account usually is like, hey, I can go in there and create new users or change people's roles. So that's more of an administrative account. And what's really important too with the administrator account, and we talk about like local administrator, That's specific to that device. So, you could be a local administrator on your computer. And what that actually does is gives you access to install applications or manipulate the operating system. So I can sit there and say, I don't want this to look this way. I want to change that, or I want to delete this. So that's when we use some of these examples. And why these things are important, statistically, most cybercrimes involves some kind of privileged access. These, when we said like keys of the kingdom, we talk about domain admin, that's what criminals are really after sometimes, is like, I want access to everything. So you really want to make sure these kind of accounts are protected. Even like the local administrator, is people think, hey, it's just one device. Well, that one device maybe has access to a lot of things, or you can use that just as a hopping point. So there's a lot of these kind of things you really want to protect. So in the next section, that we talk about the configuration. So when it comes to privileged accounts, we actually, as you can see there, we have 3 different tiers, and we have it broken up as the essential. And these are things, hey, if you're going to do anything, this is what you should be doing. If you want to do something a little bit better, we have, that better the road kind of thing. And then, if we are a very mature or, a large organization, maybe you would be looking at that optimized column. But, we try to make this applicable to all sizes of organizations. So yes, if there's only 2 or 3 employees, maybe that optimize isn't the best thing for you, but the essential is like, hey, we need to have these in place. But even if you are a large organization, you want to make sure those essential things are put in place, because we see a lot of these incidents. I know someone had asked about what can the organizations have done with like ransomware. A lot of these things are the essentials. Hey, they had to, these things in place. And how these actually work is if you're looking at doing the better kind of column, you want to make sure all the essential things are done first, because they do build off each other. So just looking at this as an example for the essentials and privilege access, the first thing bullet point there is end users are not set up as local administrators on the endpoints. And the second one there is, because people do have to have privilege accounts, that they use 2 accounts. So instead of me, if I am a privilege account and I do have access to a lot more things, maybe I have 2 accounts. I have one set up for day-to-day, where when I'm checking my email and just surfing the web, I use that account. But hey, in those cases where I do have to log into a secure server, or I have to install a program, I use that second account. And for each of those, you'll see down below, we actually give you a little to-do list on those. And those are those tactical things. It says, remove or ensure that end users are not set up as local administrators on their workstations. So these are the kind of things you can do, and just, hey, maybe you're already doing that, and that's great. You can just sort of check on and go on. And, the same thing, the other 2 is set up separate accounts for people who do require them, and educate people about their privilege accounts. Because some people they don't realize it. If maybe they're a local administrator and they don't even realize it. So they're just going out and downloading some stuff, and hey, I can just install it. It's not stopping me. It must be fine. So those are the kind of things you really want to think about. And I'm not going to get in detail about every one of these, but as you can see, we sort of build on that. So, for that better, you're looking at things like, hey, maybe those privileged accounts, you're looking at more stringent password requirements. So, hey, maybe there's 15 characters instead of our normal 8, maybe enable multi-factor, things like that. And with optimize, you're looking at things, maybe there's solutions you want to put in place. You want to look at something like LAPS, which is a program that controls local administrative passwords, or privilege access management, which is a solution that really gives you an extra layer of protection against those privileged accounts. That would be, again, for a very mature organization if you're doing that, but we really wanted to give those kind of things some information to you. And that last piece for each of those controls is, again, what we talked about. We provide some questions that you can ask your managed service provider. So let's just, like we said in the example, hey, we outsource all of our IT. We don't have things. Well, here's just some questions we could ask. And we're just doing an example of, the first one says, do you set up our users with local administrative rights? A good response is they say, no one has local administrative rights. That's very limited kind of thing. That's great. But if they say, yep, we set everybody up, that might just be a warning sign. We're not saying, the service provider is bad or anything like that. It's just something you want to think about. And we provide that little impact of, hey, if you're an administrator, if you have local administrative access, here are some of the risks. We talked about it, but, you can install software, maybe, you can uninstall certain things. So if you have endpoint protection, you can uninstall that, and you're much more likely to get malware and things like ransomware, because how things usually work is I need permission to do things. And if I already have the permission when I open my email, that's when it goes, crazy. So you really want to try to limit that. And so for the rest of the, we're going to go through some of the rest of those foundational controls we had up before. We're not going to go into that much detail, but we just want to make sure you're aware of them, just so you're some of these terms and just why they're important.
Okay. So yeah, Matt's talked a little bit about privileged user access. So let's talk about the rest of the ones again, and those fundamental controls. And then these are, again, when we looked at organizations that had been breached, these are the things that could have saved them. So the second one after privileged access is data backup and recovery. The idea here being that, especially with ransomware nowadays, if you get hit with ransomware, if your data gets corrupted or lost or stolen, one of the most important things you can do is have those backups to be able to recreate it. And the way we look at this is we want 3 types of backups, or what we say is we call them 3, 2, 1. You want 3 copies. It's this right here. You want 3 copies of your data. You want it to be on 2 media types. I don't know what happened right there with that arrow there. Apologize. But so we've got 3 copies. So in this case, we've got 3 copies of our data on VMs. We've got two media types. We've got on disk, and then we've got 1 on the cloud. And then we want to have 1 copy off-site. So we've got 1 copy in our off-site remote. So use this formula as you go into as you meet with your IT provider or with your IT team and talk about, have we got the 3-2-1? Are we following the 3-2-1 model of backups? We need 3 copies, 2 media types, and 1 copy is off-site. And then you got to test these backups. You got to make sure it works. And go back to that manufacturer. They didn't have backups that worked. They hadn't tested them appropriately. The worst time to figure out that your backups aren't working is when you've had a data breach or when you've had ransomware. Test them ahead of time. Make sure your backups work and you recover that data. Another foundational principle is what we call multi-factor authentication. I'm going to try to explain this because some of you might have heard this and are very well aware of it. But I just want to give it a little bit overview. Again, we start with just the word authentication. That's how the computer knows who you are. You authenticate yourself to the computer. The computer says, oh, this is Anders. I know this user. And usually we authenticate using a password. That's traditionally been the method of authentication. But there's a couple different ways you can look at authentication. And there's 3 different really terminologies that we use for how you authenticate. It's something you know, something you have, or something you are. And so something you know is a password. That's what, like I said, we've used in the past. But also, you could authenticate with something you have, like a smartphone, like a hardware key, like a smart card, or something you are, like a fingerprint, facial recognition, retina scan. All these things can authenticate you to the computer. Now, what we're trying to get to is to not just have one method of authentication, but to have multiple authentication methods. So many of you have already probably come across some of these types of systems before, whether it's with your email systems, with Office 365, with Google, with some of your banks or other platforms might have already implemented 2-factor authentication. For example, you'll go into your bank account, your bank's website, you'll type in your password, and it'll say, just send a PIN to your phone and enter that PIN here, and then we'll give you access. Well, you had to know something, and that was that password. But then you had to have something, and that was the smartphone. The only way you're going to get that PIN number is if you receive that text on your smartphone and are able to put it in. So now we've got 2 methods of authentication, 2 factors of authentication. And we need to use this more abundantly throughout our organizations. We need to implement this all the places we can, because multi-factor authentication can block over 99.9% of account compromise attacks. It is a very effective tool. And whether it's with your IT team or your service provider, look for ways you can exercise the systems you have to put in place multi-factor authentication. In a lot of cases, if you're not using it, it might already be an option of tools you can use. Office 365 has it inherent in it. A lot of these tools already have this capability. We just have to go implement it, roll it out, educate employees, but recognize you're going to save yourself a lot of heartache if you can put multi-factor authentication in place. The next thing I want to talk about is endpoint protection. And this word endpoint, I want to just talk about it a bit, just so we make sure we're on the same page. Because when we're talking about endpoints, we're talking about where the data ends up. And it's really at a computer or a workstation. If I send out a request to the internet saying, give me the homepage for google.com. So I type in google.com. It's going to send that request out, and back to me is going to come the information about that allows me to display the Google homepage. Well, that data is ending up with me. My computer, my laptop, or my workstation is the endpoint, and it's at those endpoints that humans interact with computers, and that's where the risk is. Many of the risk is where humans actually connect with computers and interact with computers. So we need to protect those endpoints. It's the laptops, it's the workstations that we need to protect. 68% of IT security professionals say their company experienced one or more endpoint attacks that compromised data assets or IT infrastructure in 2019. And that was an increase of 54% of respondents since 2017. So there's a huge increase of risk of what's happening at the endpoint. And traditionally, we've used antivirus software to help protect our endpoints. But solutions like McAfee and Symantec are no longer really giving us the level of protection we need. We need what are called next generation endpoint protection tools. We've listed a couple here on the slide. We're not advocating one or any of these in particular, but Carbon Black, Windows Defender, ATP, CrowdStrike, Sophos. These are just some of the many great solutions that your organization could implement. And these next generation tools are much more effective at identifying risky behaviors that files might have, identifying potential things that are not that are out of the norm of how an application or a document or a file should act, and they are able to isolate those particular tools, those particular potential risky activities before it gets out, and so into the rest of the network or the malware is propagated. So something like ransomware, which we talked about earlier, some of these endpoints can actually cut off if it senses ransomware is being deployed on that particular endpoint. It can cut that endpoint off from the rest of the network immediately, and so it doesn't propagate into everything else. This is an important tool to think about what you've got, recognize whether there needs to be an improvement in your endpoint protection, and find something that'll help protect you. Firewall with security services, and we've talked about firewalls for a long time as a security industry, but these sort of newer security services that are available are able to do a much better job of being able to take the data that comes across them and break it apart, identify things that are malicious, and pull them out. And maybe just to kind of take a step back, when we talk about firewall, we're talking about the device that protects an organization's network from the internet. It sits between your organization and the internet. So all the emails and the web traffic that's coming back and forth, that firewall is intended to protect and make sure malicious things don't come in, and important things that shouldn't go out don't go out. But new firewalls are much more effective in breaking apart that data, identifying, like the example here at the top. We've got an email that's coming in from Google, and it's a Gmail email coming in, and it's got an exploit attached to it. Maybe the user doesn't even know it's coming, it's got an exploit. Well, the firewall can break that email apart. It can see that it's got that exploit in it. It can pull that exploit off and then send that email on to the authorized user. So they're very effective tools when set up correctly. What we see a lot of small organizations, because sort of small, we went out to Best Buy and we found some firewall and we think, hey, this should do us. We got some router that our internet service provider gave to us, and we've implemented that. And what we see is a lot of organizations that need to make that jump to a business class firewall with security services. So doing an evaluation of your current tools and infrastructure is going to be important to understand, wait, maybe we just need to invest in a little stronger of a firewall. As far as email security, there's two aspects of email security we want to talk about briefly. We could talk a long time about email security, but the first thing is that we talk about secure delivery of email. So if I'm sending an email out with sensitive information, recognize that email by itself, as it's sent, is not encrypted and is not secure. There are other tools or protocols that need to be put into place to help secure that. So unless you've got a specific secure solution to help you send a secure email, you should not be sending social security numbers, credit cards, any sensitive healthcare data or any sensitive data in general over email. It's a very risky thing to do because email is sent in clear text once it leaves your organization. So just be aware that email by itself is not secure. You need a third-party tool or protocol set up so that it can securely transmit information that's sensitive. The second part of email security we want to talk about is protection from malicious emails, because you can see there on this slide, 94% of all malware that was delivered in 2018 was delivered through email. That is the conduit through which bad malware, bad applications hackers are getting into our network through email. And so looking at tools that can help filter those potential malicious emails, tools like Mimecast, Proofpoint. If you're with Office 365, Advanced Threat Protection is a great tool if configured correctly, can help protect you. But what they'll do is it just takes away or it'll filter a lot of that malicious email, so it doesn't even get to the user. So the user doesn't even have a chance to click on the link. It's a great, these solutions are really good as a first line of defense. Not the only defense, but as a great first line of defense. Another thing we've seen a lot of organizations do, and you might come across this as well. See this email down here? We see a lot of organizations putting in place messages like banners across the emails if something's coming from outside their organization, or if the email can't be validated in the from field. Hey, this might not be coming from the person it says it's coming from, so you need to validate that. Or this is coming from outside our organization. We talk about those business email compromise, and we shared that example of that CEO whose email was compromised, and it sent the email that said, hey, would you move this, make this wire transfer fund? Having this type of banner could potentially have helped that organization, that office manager recognize that, hey, this is not coming from inside my organization. I might need to be a little more cautious with that. So there's some things you can do with email security, and that'll help protect your organization. With wireless security, we've been using wireless now as a society for a long time, and there's a lot of security products and protocols that are built into wireless technologies. And so I don't want to go into depth here, but there's a couple warning signs we want to share with you. And the first is, if everybody knows your wireless password, it's not a great secure method of connecting. So be careful who you're giving the password out to, and make sure it's specifically if you've got two different networks. And that kind of goes to the next two bullet points. No separate network. If you don't have a separate network for work and personal devices, you're at risk. We should never have employees coming with phones and connecting to our corporate network. We should have a separate segregated guest network or employee network that doesn't allow those devices to connect to our the workplace we do business, the network you do business on. And if you can access internal resources on the guest network, that's also a problem. You don't want guests coming in and logging in with their laptop, putting in the password for the Wi-Fi, and being able to go over to where your finance keeps their data. And lastly, if your default passwords are utilized, all these wireless routers come with default passwords. We should really be changing those passwords when they first get installed. If it's never been changed, you might want to do that on a periodic basis. But if you got employees who are leaving, you got turnover. If you just got over a period of time, you're going to have more likely that it's been compromised. Just change it on a regular basis. And lastly, I want to talk about password management. Just educate users on what good passwords look like. The security industry has made some changes in the last little while, and one of the biggest changes is that length trumps complexity. We used to say, hey, you need to have a password that's 8 characters and as complex, or has different types of characters in it, uppercase, lowercase, numbers, special characters. But what we're finding is that length is going to give you a better password than having it complex. So we often help organizations or talk to organizations about putting in passphrases. Passphrases being taking a series of words that don't have anything to do with each other and putting them up next to each other is a great way to create a password. Things like, I'm just going to take 4 random words: unicorn, light, frame, cookie. If you just took those 4 words together and spelled them out, and that's my password, it's never going to get broken. A hacker's never going to be able to break that password because it's so long. So as best you can, look for ways to strengthen passwords. Utilize password managers. Here at Eide Bailey, we utilize one called LastPass. It's a great tool, but there's lots of tools out there for password management. 50% of users use the same passwords for all accounts, and that's a real risk. And we've seen where breaches in one area, like the Yahoo breach, that exposed passwords, and some of those users use the same passwords, and hackers use them to then go log into Facebook accounts or LinkedIn accounts. So utilize password managers. Longer passwords are better. So as we wrap up here, just some things to think about. We've given you a lot to think about today. Again, you've got the guidebook that's going to be there to help your organizations begin to take next steps wherever you might be. But here's some things to think about. And these really have a lot more of a business standpoint, security from a business standpoint than from just an IT standpoint. So we want to kind of get out of your mind that security is we want to stop thinking of security as an IT issue and more of a business issue. And so here's some questions you can take back to your leadership team. Do you know where your sensitive data is stored and how it's handled by third parties? How long can your business sustain if all your data is inaccessible or deleted? Has your organization discussed if they would pay a ransom if affected by ransomware? Are you providing enough security training and awareness for all users? So you can see that there's a lot of things as a business, even though we're not IT people, we need to start thinking about IT and recognizing that we're all in this together, and we've got to give IT the tools to be successful and our people the tools to understand their roles. As a recap, we're going to be here this year helping SDAO and member organizations. We've got the guidebook that you should all have access to. We're going to be conducting a series of webinars around cybersecurity topics that you can send a representative to and participate in. We're going to conduct 3 security awareness training sessions that you can invite all your employees to come to. And then we're going to provide office hours, and you can reach out to us and begin scheduling those at any time. All right, so we're going to go back and ask if we've got any questions. Greg, you still there?
I am still here. And I know Matthew's been typing away at some of them, but one of the ones I think you kind of answered, but maybe you could kind of go back to is, or now it's gone. Okay, here.
Redacted.
So when you guys originally spoke with about some of the recent attacks that organizations have had, can you maybe just recap again what those organizations could have done after fixing the ransomware issue the first time?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to this stage 1 foundational security. These were the things: the privileged access, the data backups. These are the things those organizations could have done that would have saved their bacon, that would have helped them not have to go through that. And all that's outlined in the cybersecurity guidebook, how to implement those things.
Yeah, and even after they had an attack, they didn't go through and update a lot of things, or they didn't make sure people had administrative rights.
Right.
They still didn't do those kind of things. They didn't put endpoint protection on their devices. They didn't turn on 2FA, the multi-factor authentication. That's what they could have done to probably stop the next one, which they didn't do.
Another question that's coming in as well is as members are starting to do more virtual meetings and conferences and everything. When Zoom first came out, there was a big concern about how secure Zoom was.
Right.
So with that, are there other platforms like GoToMeeting or Google Meets and Zoom? How are they? Have you guys heard anything how they are secure now or better secured?
So with those, and Zoom, was in the news because, again, it blew up in popularity. It just went from overnight. It was, hey, it was used. And then all of a sudden it was like, everyone has to use it. So there were a lot of things, which they have gone and fixed a lot of things. A lot of it, even with anything, Zoom, GoToMeeting, the Google Meets, kind of thing like that. The big thing you want to remember is there are usually some settings. You can turn on like, hey, point-to-point encryption. So, this things usually that's done by the user settings. I'm not familiar with every one of them, but I know it's usually something you have to turn on. A lot of times too, there's usually just best practices, for like things like Zoom. I know a lot of times you can have your personal Zoom meeting. So it's sort of like, this is my little office and I can share it with my coworkers and we can jump on it. You really don't want to make sure like those things are public. If you're going to have a bunch of people come on from the outside your organization, you don't want to post that on Facebook and be like, hey, join our town hall meeting and use that, because it's a personal thing. So people see that, they keep it, and they can jump on pretty much any time. So you don't want to advertise that. You want to make sure you do put like a passcode on those meetings so people just can't jump on with a link. That's why in the beginning you saw those Zoom bombings, they call them. And you really want to make sure, hey, there's passcodes, it is shared, you have to be a registered user, things like that. And they've put a lot of these things in place now that it really improve, but there's still some things on the user end that you really have to do yourself still.
And I would just point you to Zoom's website. They've got a great tool on how to make Zoom secure. They take it seriously. So.
Okay. And I would say we probably have time for one more question. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask some of the members are now asking, how do they sign up for office hours?
Yeah, you can just reach out to us directly. I'll get my slide up here, but you'll see the copy of the slides.
And the slides can be found on the session platform as well.
So you can reach out to us directly via email and either to Matt and myself, and we can set those up right now.
Okay, well, it is basically noon, so I wanted to thank Matthew and Anders for your time and for doing the presentation. Attendees, thank you for attending the session. Be sure to fill out the session evaluation by visiting the session page within the conference platform. As a reminder, we'll be holding our caucus meetings this afternoon at 1 o'clock. So to find your caucus, just visit the session page. Also, we will be hosting a virtual trivia at 3 p.m., which is also accessible by visiting the session page. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me using the attendee connections, and I'd be happy to help. As a reminder, the exhibitor showroom is open on your breaks, so please feel free to swing by and check those out. Other than that, we hope that everybody has a wonderful day and hope to see you guys in other sessions. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.